This is the latest in a series of Tree Council of Ireland videos on the general topic of forestry, trees and all things related. Today we have a talk by Dr. Rory Harrington, who has several degrees in forestry and is an environmental consultant to VESI, which is an integrated wetlands construction company. So he has a lot of expertise too in the, if you like, the science of water management, and often obviously the tree issues, forestry issues, silvicultural issues can be integrated with the whole management of water for various purposes and can produce highly useful results and environmentally friendly results. So without further ado, I would like to pass you over to Dr. Rory Harrington.
Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, like yourself, I have a long history in forestry and have an even wider one in the landscape of the country and its ecology. And it's interesting how Ireland is so vastly deforested compared with other European countries. It's imperative that we put forest back into the landscape where once it existed, right across Europe. And Ireland, being probably the most deforested for the longest period of time, is one that's deserving of that action. And the forests can be established on farmland, and that's the focus of our efforts today. Ireland's forests are relatively simple habitats, though in the past they were more complex, and they have had effects on local climate even. They, when removed, provided a wonderful grazing land, but in the upper reaches of in the uplands of the country, those forests gave way to moorland, losing their nutrients, washed away to the wetlands below. So storms and fire and herbivory are important factors, but most important of all was the way that humans burnt the forests many thousands of years ago, probably as early as 10 to 9,000 years. The problem is that most people in the country, and particularly the farming community, are probably underestimating how much forest there was and how important it was. So this little presentation today is about trying to encourage them to re-establish trees, woods and forests on their land. I think it's important to realize that most human land use practices in Ireland, or indeed most of Europe, were exploitative. They are generally undertaken in ways that focus on short-term economic gain. This may be just to carry a few livestock as it was in the past, but today that has expanded, and indeed biodiversity through the various methodologies that are applied has seen the demise of a lot of biodiversity, no less than in the swards of the grazing lands which dominate the country. The more direct the involvement of farmers in tree establishment has been my experience, is that the greater appreciation that they learn and follow through with. I've seen farmers plant a few trees and then over maybe 5-10 years plant some more and expand their interest. A lot of effort today is made to plant native species that are deemed native. But, you know, we've been planting a far wider range of tree species in this country over many hundreds of years. As these species came to be recognized for their values. And sometimes it's not always appreciated that they too can have a role to play in the country. A role that has been recognized by the UN Convention on Biodiversity, which has established 12 principles for the application of improved biodiversity. And that is that they should have social, economic, and environmental benefits. You can't separate those three. And building that, I think it's important to realize that a lot more can be done. Let's take, for example, the benefit of trees for shelter and many other benefits through thoughtful positioning of those trees. The effect of shelter has been measured at up to 10 times its height. Shelter provides protection and support for both crops and livestock. And in fact, planting a farm judiciously placed shelter may be very effective in reducing the calorific demands on the, or if you like, the energy demands on stock, or indeed on crops. Of course, the appropriate tree species and density for the shelter is needed. Tree shelter can benefit in many other different ways, providing shade at times when we do have prolonged sunlight, as a windbreak, which would be the main reason, and indeed even protection in storms. And these benefits can be assessed and have been assessed economically. The design and composition of the shelter varies with topography, the density and scale, and the tree species and density at establishment are important considerations for the success of this outcome. Sharing shelter between landowners is another approach. I have written about this for the Crown magazine, and it has been well received. So two adjoining farmers could together establish a wider and deeper and more economic and more effective shelter, or indeed even one could call it a forest. There are additional benefits, not only the social one, and you have sharing neighbors involved, but there could be an economic one, because the trees could be managed more economically with greater density and dimension to that endeavor, but also the environmental gains, because what you've got is a deeper and wider habitat, and therefore providing extra dimension to the habitat that you've created. Important in the establishment of shelter is aspect and orientation, and of course soil type. and indeed farm management needs. I have neighbours here in Waterford who have planted considerable amounts of forest for their own management needs on the farm. And the first and most important one is stake material, but also firewood, and indeed, in years to come, it will provide timber of value. Shelter, I believe, should be established in ways that harmonize with the adjoining and even distant landscapes. Badly positioned doesn't to optimize the effects or benefits of the effort. So consideration to how they are placed in the landscape is important. As indeed is species composition. And in here, we might depart from the idea of just planting native species alone. Of course, the two can be combined. Remember that the vast majority of land, of farms in this country have been devoid of trees for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
That's very interesting. I'd just be interested in questioning on some of the things you said there. We know that the Ice Age ended 13,000 years ago. Then for, I think it was roughly 1,000 years, the Younger Dryas appeared and everything froze over again, and then that lifted. So, you know, the sea level varied a lot during all that time, and things might have got to the south of the country at certain eras and so forth. So how useful, if you like, is and also that man was, you know, modifying whatever got here or whatever, you know, developed here when the ice receded. How useful is our current crop of, you know, native species, given that it was a pretty random process to do with the sea level rise and all the rest of it, and had little or nothing to do with the suitability of the island post-Ice Age for, you know, various plants, animals, etc., that are common on the nearby continent. Nothing to do with that. It was more to do with, you know, things that could travel quickly, like birds and so forth, got here, and things like tree seeds and so forth that didn't. So in the context of all that, how useful in terms of, you know, looking at the warming world we're in and looking at the species rather, you know, poor species mix we have. And I know you have said in the past that it's not just the number of trees we have, but even all the associated ecology with those trees, you know, is very poor in Ireland. You have mentioned in the past that we don't have wood decomposers, for example, in anything like the numbers you have in the continent of Europe. And you've also mentioned that, for example, you know, we read about the oak tree has, I can't remember the exact number, but thousands of species that uniquely depend on it. And but that research is done on continental Europe or maybe Southeast England, and it doesn't apply at all to, you know, oak trees grown in Ireland. So what's your view generally then on this idea of native trees only, or the environmental stroke biodiversity value of replacing our sterile, you know, bare land on agricultural sites only with native trees?
Oh, very limited, and indeed probably incorrect, because the evolutionary background of the tree species that grow in Ireland and grow successfully in Ireland goes way back before the last ice age. What's the cutoff point? We know, for example, that it's often quoted that Sequoia sempervirens once grew in Ireland. I don't know the reference to that, but so it is said. Yes, because the species that can grow, mostly conifers of great diversity, have a history that goes back many millions of years, far predating the time when Ireland was isolated, far predating the time perhaps before the Atlantic opened up. If one compares the flora of North America with the flora of Western Europe, there are lots of, probably the dominant genera are shared across the Atlantic. So one has to take that into consideration. And indeed, I believe the statement and indeed the explanation for it written by Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most eminent geneticists of the last century, when he wrote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, is so relevant today that we, I think, have lost the benefits of that insight, which he explained in that wonderful short essay, which, by the way, was presented to the secondary school teachers in North America in 1973. So understanding the evolutionary background is critical. And when you think about it, some of the species of tree, I'm talking about woody trees, alive today, have a continuous history going back 200 million years. It makes you think, especially when you think of it in terms of the recent availability of the island of Ireland for the growth of trees. Also, you know, we find through various what can I say, investigations, that many of the forests of Ireland are now under the sea. Off the coast of Bray, for example, I know off the coast of Kerry, Ballinskelligs and other places like that, there are the remnants of forests. Now, probably the same species that are alive today, because these are close inshore waters and consequently represent only recent drowning. But the sea level rises is a dynamic in its own right. And indeed, as the state supports the investigation of the Celtic Sea in particular, who knows what we will find. But you know, continental landmass, European continental landmass, certainly north of the Pyrenees and north of the Alps, cut off the supply, if you like, or the invasion or the re-establishment of trees following the warming up after the Ice Age. And indeed, one goes to Scandinavia, one finds that the spruces in particular came from the east and not from the south, which is again highly, in my view, highly interesting, because it just shows that ice was an inhibitor for colonization. Mm. So yes, it's interesting, and that, you know, we talk about Norway spruce, but the source of the Norway spruce was not from Germany or from Denmark or whatever, which might seem to be the intuitive way to look at it, but rather over the Gulf of Bothnia and through Finland. So these are surprising things. And indeed, if one looks at the spruce, one finds a wide degree of capacity to survive in many different climatic zones. In comparison, Scots pine and a similar northern species is very much adapted locally. And indeed, the Scots pine of Western Scotland is very different from the Scots pine of central Scotland, to the Caledonian area, and certainly of the east, which actually came to has its closest relatives in northern Germany and Poland, and of course in the Netherlands. So yeah, these are all very much influenced by the last ice age, which is relatively recent, has lasted, I suppose, only 1 million years out of the hundreds of million years which this evolutionary dynamic was taking place.
Yeah, I just suppose follow that up with a quick question of some species. Beech springs to mind, sycamore, obviously.
Yeah.
Horse chestnut, it came from a bit further, but it thrives here, and so on. We all know the common trees in Ireland that are not regarded as natives, even though they thrive here. Is this, have they less value in terms of, you know, the general environmental biodiversity, and, well, obviously in terms of carbon capture, they're certainly no worse, not better in some cases than our native species. But is it just there's no fundamental biological reason why they're not included in our native species list? Is it just down to, you know, chance?
Yeah, there's a number of issues arising here, which I think is very important. First of all, we can't reinvent the past. The species alive today have come through various dynamic processes to be what they are today. And the ecology is similarly presented. So is it important that we address the current challenges? And what are they? They are carbon sequestration, the facilitation of social needs. We have become more and more urbanized. So how can we connect with nature if we're not inspired by it? And in my opinion, it's been inspiring me for as long as I can remember. You know, nothing like a woodland to inspire. Whether it was Muir Woods near Berkeley in California, with its coastal redwoods, or Yosemite, or indeed the oak forests of southern Germany. They're all inspirational. But even at home here in Ireland, it's interesting that my first encounter with forestry was at Avondale, and back in the 1963, when I initially studied forestry, I was inspired by what I saw at Avondale. I think it's one of the great treasure troves of this country, that we have a few places like Avondale to demonstrate the diversity of trees and what they can give to society. You know, the Japanese have invented this term called forest bathing. It's just, you know, most of the forests of Japan are heavily influenced by human effort, and but notwithstanding that, they have a good forest cover, and people have promoted the use of the forest for psychological purposes. And indeed, that's very easy to see here if one is directed in the right direction. By the way, I have been similarly impressed on my trips to New Zealand, where I have visited again coastal redwood forests in New Zealand, and absolutely inspired. It's as if, you know, the dinosaurs were going to peek out through the stems. It's that so inviting, and we shouldn't be afraid that just because trees have been around for so long as to engage with them. And indeed, people talk about oak. The Fagaceae evolved initially in the southern hemisphere, down in what is today South America.
Okay, before I ask you any more questions, and I'd like to follow up on some of them, I would like to introduce Orla Farrell from Cron, who has set up an organization called Easy Treesy. And just to put it in context, Orla and ourselves, and very much thanks to Quilta, who have made available saplings to us, have been planting for the last few years up to 150,000 native trees. Basically the same kind of, the range of native trees that expressed by the Forest Service of native trees. So I would like to hand over to Orla. I'll come back to you on some of the things you said later, and I might comment on some of the stuff you said afterwards. But I'd like to hand over to Orla here, who has some questions. And I say Orla, like ourselves, is one of the major planters of native woodland in the country at the moment. Orla.
Thanks very much, Brendan. And what a treat it is, Rory, if you'll pardon the pun, to be chatting with you today for National Biodiversity Week. So you mentioned Avondale, and in fact, we planted a tree there during National Tree Week with some local school children. And it's very important to us that the trees that we plant will have success and will survive. So after chatting with you on several occasions, Rory, and hearing the great expertise and depth of knowledge that you had, I thought you'd be the very man to advise us about trees on the farms. We have a lot of farmer cooperatives who are interested in starting some tree planting. I was speaking, in fact, to an uncle of mine yesterday in Fermoy, County Cork, and he would have grown up with my mother on a farm, and he had a story about them coming home from Mass on a horse and trap one Sunday, and all of them getting thrown out of the horse and trap for whatever reason. So nothing would do my grandmother only to buy a motor car after this. So an avenue of elms was sold to purchase the motor car. And I know that my uncle was detailed to go and plant a field of trees to replace these elms. So he told me they planted them, and when the weekend was over, they went out and all of the trees had been eaten by rabbits. So very dismayed with this story. I've been looking for the definitive method of protecting our young trees, because quite often there would be rabbits or hares or deer that would be very tempted by the luscious saplings that are provided to us by our sponsoring nurseries, Quilta, Trees on the Land, and other nurseries. We protected them with ribbons when we were starting out. And it was a 7-year-old child in my class in Baldoyle who said, teacher, look quick, this ribbon is eating into the sapling. And we had forgotten to take off the red ribbons after Valentine's Day. We'd put them there to stop our trees being trimmed away, which is another great danger that we have. So strimmers and mowers are really enemy number one of our planting projects. So I would like to ask you, Rory, about the tree protection fencing that you mentioned to me, never known to fail.
Well, I did spend a long sojourn in the National Parks and Wildlife Service in charge of mammals, and of course part of that remit was the protection of not only trees but habitats and so forth, you know. So yeah, it's this is one that has tested the best brains found across the world. How do you do this most effectively? Some people talk about odorous chemicals which they can spray on the trees. Other people have suggested something that deters or by just making them unpalatable. But probably the most dependable one is exclusion. And here we have a situation whereby the strategy for tree establishment has to be placed on the right scale. And some of the best examples of this I've seen in the Brandenburg area of near Berlin, where a simple a wire mesh was hung up on a partially harvested area of trees, and the bushes and the branches of the persisting vegetation was used. No stakes were involved. I think maybe where there was a gate to get in, and the mesh was just hung up on that. I've seen other areas where the fence was best applied where the fence leant out, so as and this is against deer, so that's the animals nosed up to the wire and then raised their nose up to see if there was possible to get over it, because they are intelligent animals. And they found, oh, it went up and against them, so they did not push it, and that was very effective. The same has to apply for rabbits, and probably even a more challenging predator on young plantations, and that has to be a little bit more thorough. But very high fences not needed, of course, in this, and maybe attention to the bottom of the fence more than to the top, where the wire comes out, so the animal coming up to the fence is actually standing on some of the wire and doesn't have the thought process to come back out further and dig under it in that way. So they're important things, you know. There's huge interaction here on the scale at which trees are planted. We have kind of, following agriculture, industrialized the land, I feel, and consequently large blocks of forests and their management are considered to be the, may I say, only option, whereas smaller groups could be planted. And I do, and even in Scandinavia, that as little as 1/4 of a hectare may be the largest area that can be felled in any one sweep. And that's very manageable from the use of these techniques. There are also other approaches, but they're the two main ones that I know for the small animals and for the bigger animals. Of course, for stock, because if you're going to introduce trees on the farm, you have to consider that that's important too. And so that's so if one is going to look at that, stock fencing for cattle and so forth is absolutely paramount. Or indeed, does that help?
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Rory. I love the fact that you can reuse this fencing as well, that you can pick it up and move it a few years later.
Yeah. Why not? I mean, is on our own farm, we have fencing here, which is more than 30 years old, nearly 35 years old. And I have to say, it's still as good as when we purchased it. So why not reuse it?
Yes, Excellent. I have a second question for you. So my uncle's daughter, I was very excited to hear the other day, has bought a farm not far from you, Rory. And the first chance I get to see her now, I'm going to see if I can talk her into putting some trees on her farm. So I'm just wondering, to this cousin who doesn't have a farming background and who'd like some simple instructions as to where to begin, would you have a sort of top 3 tips on how a farmer who wants to do a little bit in this area might start?
Well, first of all, site selection. Pick a site which you will visit and keep an eye on. I think that's very important. Pick a site that enhances the landscape. I think that's very important. Pick a scale that will make it meaningful. And maybe in that instance, pick a range of species, but native and non-native.
Very good. Thanks, Rory.
Out of the discussion there, just one quick question, because I think you referenced, farmers wanting to maybe plant a little bit of their field and all that. That comes up against, I suppose, the huge disaster, I'd call it, but maybe not everyone would agree with me, where a farmer or somebody with a big back garden or anybody now has to apply for permission to plant, to the Forest Service, to plant for more than 1/4 of an acre or 1/10 of a hectare, which is a tiny cabbage patch of trees. Now, I believe the government has set up a committee, has a recommendation to do that, but it has to go through an EIS, and it's not clear what's going to happen there. It would appear that the effect of this has been devastating in terms of our afforestation, and afforestation means planting on land that is not already forest or woodland, fields, whatever. So I'd be just interested in your view on that, Rory. It seems to have cut the afforestation program in Ireland, which is a big part of our net zero commitments to 2050 and all that. It seems to have almost wiped that out. So I just wonder if you have any comments, Rory.
Well, I have a question too, to whoever might listen to this broadcast. And that is, what happens if you plant one line of trees? As you know, a line doesn't have any area. So,
I think, Rory, you could plant a line from here, which is Dublin, to Donegal, and that wouldn't be a problem. Unfortunately, it wouldn't solve very many problems either.
No, but my point is, it's a simple logic that a line doesn't have area.
No.
So one line of trees.
An Irish solution. You went to the Yale School of Forestry, is it, Rory?
Well, then there is how close must the next plot be? Can the next plot be 11 meters away?
Well, I don't know. We wondered if we plant 1/10 of an acre, which is an astonishingly, 1/4 of an acre.
A hectare, yes, that's 10 by 10 meters, yeah.
It's an extraordinary small, as I say, many suburban back gardens would actually include an area that size. Okay. And, if you plant that and you leave a 2-meter gap between them, and you plant another one and leave a 2-meter gap and all the rest of it, which won't make much difference to the eventual forest, is that allowed? So far as I can see from talking with the relevant authorities, they're not really sure. They don't recommend it because they think it might or might not be in line with the spirit of the law, even though it might appear to be in line with the letter of the law. I suppose the big thing about this, though, is that while you don't need official planning permission, it does bring into the license. You actually could be, just think you're a farmer who wants to plant a little corner in his field, right, with lovely native woodlands, really increased biodiversity, carbon uptake, all the rest of it. And now you have to get a license to do it, which could involve you in having to do an EIS, any manner of surveys and all the rest of it. It's subject to third-party objections from people who just don't like trees, period. And it has proved to be a very effective deterrent to planting trees.
Yeah, but you know, these are human-made regulations, and in my view, always, like the law, has aspects to it which may be interpreted in a different light. As I just mentioned, a line does not have area, so one could go. How far apart must these small plots be? That's another aspect. And indeed, there is a case to be made from an agroforestry point of view of having many small plots rather than this widely spaced agroforestry approach. I've been involved in agroforestry the last nearly 50 years, and have been to New Zealand, where it was largely practiced, and less so now. It's very much practiced in China, which I've visited as well. And I have to say that the climatic conditions in Ireland don't make for, I believe, even sensible approach, because widely spaced trees do not have the mutual shelter effect that's needed for trees to grow. So better to plant in small groups of trees, maybe as little as 10 by 10 meters. I would have thought that maybe 20 by 20 meters, or even 40 by 40 meters would be quite approachable. I understand too that these regulations will be altered, but the advantage of planting in small groups, especially in a farming context, are manifold. And especially when consideration for shelter and landscape and all of these other things. The transition of a farm from a grazing production standpoint to one of forestry has to be gradual. So this has to be addressed too. You know,
okay, Roy, I suppose I tend to agree with you. I don't think agroforestry based on widely, the New Zealand system, widely planted.
But they no longer practice it
it's not optimal from an Irish point of view. And we all know that if you want to establish a woodland, and get it up quickly, etc., the best thing is to plant the trees quite close. And that applies in broadleaf stroke native trees even more than in commercial trees like Sitka spruce.
Sure.
Because they'll power away anyway. And, if you do that, you can get very valuable, biodiversity woodlands very quickly, and they can suppress the competing vegetation, which is usually monoculture grass that would otherwise be eaten by methane belching sheep or cows. It's kind of a no-brainer solution, and at the moment, if you're doing any significant, let's say even about 1 acre, you have to make absolutely sure that you're putting gaps between the plantations of dense wood with the rest to make sure you comply with the law. And I can understand that, like maybe 1 acre woodlands would be okay, and then separated from another, but it really, anything below the 1 hectare threshold is, you're just adding incredible complexity, red tape, and obstruction to the creation of, let's just say, broadleaf woodlands and non-commercial woodlands, never mind the, you know, commercial ones like solid Sitka spruce.
Yeah, these are important things that need to be explored with the benefit of science and experience. And I get the feeling that they're not, because they're not generally appreciated. I mean, our farm here in Waterford has trialed the growing of individual trees and in small groups of trees. And I have to say that we have learned a lot from that. Interestingly, only one farmer, neighbour, has endeavoured to trial, to follow through on it. And this comes back to Orla's thing. What motivates a farmer to plant trees on his farm? And I'm suggesting, the benefits are manifold, shelter being number one. Habitats, yes, maybe you won't get all the benefits of a native species woodland as quickly or as plentiful as compared with a non-native thing, but you will get a lot of the benefits. The most important one, as I said earlier, is shelter. Shelter is one of the great challenges that Ireland has to accommodate an improved living, especially when you're outside. And this applies also, of course, as I said, to the stock that are forced to stay outside for more than, well, nearly 8 months of the year.
Okay, Rory, we have lots more questions, I'm sure, but we'll never get finished if you don't continue your next part of your talk. So I'll hand over to you.
Site preparation are really the foundation of which a tree can successfully grow or has the optimum chance of growing. And so along with protecting your tree, site and ground preparation for planting are really critical. There's a general lack of awareness amongst farmers, and indeed to some extent amongst foresters and other interested parties, in the need to prepare the ground for planting. The control of competing vegetation, drainage and associated ground topography, soil quality, water management in particular, and as I said, this extends into drainage. The availability of mechanized ground preparation machinery is very helpful, and indeed the development of what we call the backhoe provides, that's the excavator type bucket arrangement on the tracked vehicle, provides many improved methods for tree establishment. Of course, one can plant directly into the grassland or into the field, and more about that in a moment. The general guidance is that trees be planted at about the original depth in which they're grown in the nursery. Notwithstanding this general guidance, there is another benefit accruing from planting trees on a mound. This can be a small mound or a much wider, or maybe even several meters. And this was done and mechanized even in the upland deforestation programs in the 1950s and 60s, and indeed even the 1970s, when specialist plows were used, well, they needed development and use, like the cut-person plow. The benefits from mound planting are improved tree stability through the facilitation of root access to nutrients and the avoidance of competing vegetation. It is nevertheless essential that wherever the method used, ground preparation facilitate intercepted drainage and overland flow. In fact, it is at the establishment of the tree planting that one is offered another big benefit of planting trees, to intercept rain directly and also drainage from adjacent lands or up gradient lands. Yeah, in summary, there are many considerations that might be used for further enhancing tree establishment. And, you know, there's no recipe. A formulaic approach is the worst thing that can be applied in forestry, or indeed any area of natural resource development. And I will emphasize, no formulaic approach. Let it be open. Be aware of the problems, be aware of the advantages, but explore. I mean, this is, for Ireland, one of the great new horizons that we might work towards. Then, as I said earlier, tree protection, livestock, deer, rabbits, and hares can be an ongoing risk in the establishment trees on the farm, and this again can be incorporated into the site preparation. Fencing is probably critical to be assured that the efforts of your work is not wiped out by grazing or browsing animals. And again, I would emphasize there are benefits in short-term fencing methods lasting about 5 to 10 years. After that, trees can be pretty persistent, looking after their own needs. I hope that kind of rounds it up.
This is a very interesting perspective from a man with a huge amount of experience, a very good grasp of evolutionary theory, a lot of practical experience with mammals, afforestation, wetland management, and so on. Somebody who's actually, you know, walked the walk rather than just talked the talk, and is very innovative. If you excuse me for saying that, player. So I thank you an awful lot, Rory. Obviously, you've touched on so many subjects there that if we were to, quiz you on everything, this video would go on forever. But again, I would like to thank Orla for introducing us to you. Not that I didn't know you personally, from different perspective. And again, I would sincerely hope that we can follow up on maybe specific issues you've raised in future videos. In the meanwhile, I think I'll hand over to Orla from Easy Treasy /Cron for the last word.
Thank you, Brendan.
Council.
Thank you, Siobhan. And above all, thank you, Rory, for your generosity with your time and for the thorough preparation you have done for today. This UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has the goal of planting 1 trillion trees worldwide to bring down the rising temperature of the globe by 1 degree. So there's nothing more important than the topics you've raised. the preparation of the soil, the protection of the trees, the selection of species, and all the other factors that you've mentioned to get us off to a flying start. So thank you again to all the participants, and we wish everyone a happy National Biodiversity Week. And our motto is Stop Talking, Start Planting, the motto of the Plant for the Planet Children's Project worldwide. Thank you.